It was pouring rain, and the boy's small hands trembled as he clutched the glass door, unsure if he belonged inside. On the other side, the CEO of a billion-dollar company lifted her eyes from her coffee, catching a glimpse of the child just as the waitress broke every rule in the book. Diane Mercer hadn't planned on being here. Her driver had taken a wrong turn, and now she sat in a worn-down diner off Route 47. Its linoleum floor curling at the edges and the jukebox in the corner stuck on a Roy Orbison track from another era. It smelled like grease and burnt coffee, and she hated it until that boy showed up. He couldn't have been more than 6. Thin, his cheeks hollow, skin too pale for summer. No umbrella. His soaked hoodie sagged off one shoulder. Diane was used to walking past kids like that in the city, eyes ahead, the security of tinted windows separating her from the world's pain. But here, there was no escaping it. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" the waitress asked softly, already kneeling in front of the boy before he spoke. Diane's eyes flicked to the name tag. Marla. 60, maybe more. Face lined from years of late-night shifts and lives put on hold. She looked tired, but when she smiled at the boy, it was like watching sun cut through storm clouds. "I don't got no money," the boy mumbled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Just hungry." Diane leaned forward, curious. What would the waitress do? Toss him out? Call someone? Marla stood, took his hand, and guided him gently to a booth. Diane's booth, the one right next to hers. She grabbed a towel from behind the counter and dried the boy's hair. "Pancakes okay?" she asked, like she'd done this 100 times. The boy nodded. "No charge," Marla told him, and then, eyes sharp, voice low, she added, "And no cops, either. You're safe here." Something in Diane's chest shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Excuse me," Diane said, lifting a manicured hand. "You know that's against policy, right? You're not allowed to give away food." Marla glanced at her. Calm, unapologetic. "I know," she said. Some rules were made to be broken. It was audacious. In Diane's world, rules were sacred. Budgets, contracts, deadlines, those weren't just policies, they were gospel. You followed them, or you failed. But this woman, this waitress, was openly defying them for a child who hadn't even said thank you. "Is this your diner?" Diane asked, tone-edged. Marla shook her head. "I've worked here 28 years. Long enough to know what matters." A silence stretched between them. The boy slurped orange juice beside her. Diane watched, hands still on her untouched coffee, her world beginning to tilt. She should have reported it. She should have told the manager. Instead, she asked, "What's his name?" "Didn't ask," Marla said. "Figured feeding him came first." For the next 20 minutes, Diane watched as the boy devoured pancakes with his hands, syrup dotting his cheeks. Marla brought napkins, a second plate, a warm cup of cocoa with a smile that made Diane's stomach twist. No one had smiled at her like that in years, not without wanting something in return. Her phone buzzed. A calendar alert. Quarterly board meeting. 15 minutes. Diane stood, dropped a crisp 100 on the counter, and paused. She looked down at Marla. "Don't get fired over this," she said. Marla chuckled. "Wouldn't be the worst thing that's happened this year." Diane walked out into the rain. But something followed her, not the boy, not the smell of cheap coffee, but a question. Why did it feel like the richest person in that room wasn't her? That night, Diane couldn't sleep. She had a penthouse with heated floors and a fridge stocked by a private chef, but all she could see was that boy's fingers trembling over a fork and the way Marla had handed him safety like it was part of the menu. She opened her laptop, meant to prepare for the Asia-Pacific merger call. Instead, she found herself typing, "Why do we let kids go hungry in the richest country on earth?" It spiraled from there. Articles, statistics, videos of shelters and soup kitchens. She clicked through pages until her eyes blurred, heart thudding louder with each headline. 1 in 6 American children face food insecurity. More than 38 million people in the U.S. struggle with hunger. She thought about Marla's hands, how they'd folded that towel around the boy like a mother's. How Diane herself had once gone to school with a lunch card funded by the state. She hadn't thought about that in decades. By 3 a.m., Diane had opened a new document titled Project Marla. The next day, Diane returned to the diner. Marla looked up, startled. "You again," she said. "Didn't peg you for the sentimental type." "I'm not," Diane replied. "But I am the CEO of Mercer Holdings." Marla blinked. "Should I be impressed?" "No," Diane said honestly. "But I want to talk to you about something important." She slid into the booth. "Same one as yesterday." Ordered the same black coffee. "I want to fund a program," Diane said. "A grant for local diners, cafes, even food trucks. I want to make it easy for people like you to feed kids like that boy. No red tape. No applications. Just food, fast, with dignity." Marla crossed her arms. "And what's in it for you?" "I don't know yet," Diane said, voice low. "But it felt good. Watching you help him. I want to feel that again." Marla studied her, as if trying to find the catch. "And you're calling it what?" "Project Marla," Diane said. Silence. "Then, you rich people name things after yourselves a lot, huh?" Diane smiled for the first time in a long time. "This one's not for me." The story made the front page of USA Today 3 weeks later. Billionaire launches food relief program after witnessing small act of kindness. It went viral. The boy's identity was never revealed, but people called him the Pancake Kid. Donations poured in. Diane doubled her initial pledge, then tripled it. But behind the headlines, something else happened. Diane started visiting diners, real ones. She'd sit at the counter and ask servers what they needed. She shook hands with dishwashers and hugged kitchen managers. She got her hands dirty. And Marla? She became the unlikely face of a movement. She gave interviews she never asked for, stood behind podiums she didn't understand, and cried on national TV when a stranger offered to pay off her mortgage. The boy never returned. Not to that diner, anyway. But his presence lingered, in every hungry child the program fed, and in every hardened heart that remembered what it was like to be kind before the world taught them not to be. It had been exactly 36 days since Diane Mercer last stepped into a boardroom. She hadn't disappeared, not entirely, but her priorities had. The first few weeks of Project Marla had swallowed her whole. Meetings with nonprofit organizers, calls with government partners, field trips to community centers, late-night brainstorms with developers building a tracking app for food donations, and, most importantly, visits to diners across the country. She flew commercial now. Coach. No more assistants, no entourage. She wore jeans and tied her silver blonde hair in a bun, and no one recognized her. She preferred it that way. The change wasn't sudden. It crept in like a tide. But Diane had always been a woman of precision, and now, standing in the middle of a Kansas truck stop, while a teenage waitress told her about the homeless kids behind the 7-Eleven, she realized the tide had come in fully. The old Diane. She was somewhere far back on the shore. She stayed late that night, helped wrap leftover sandwiches in foil, paid for 3 tankfuls of gas for strangers. She wasn't trying to save the world, she was trying to remember who she had been before the world told her saving wasn't profitable. It was Marla who brought up Diane's mother first. They were sitting in the same booth, days later. The diner had become their place, a headquarters of sorts. The owners didn't mind. The customers didn't even notice. The world had kept turning, unaware that something quiet and miraculous had begun here. Marla poured the coffee, strong and hot. Diane sipped it and winced. Still terrible. Marla smirked. It's always been terrible. That's not the point. Diane stared at the steam. I've been thinking about my mother, she said, her voice unusually soft. She worked nights. Hotel maid. I used to wait up for her with a cold grilled cheese. Marla leaned in, resting her elbows on the table. You ever tell people that? No, Diane admitted. I spent my life trying to make people forget where I came from. Funny, Marla said. You spend the first half of your life running from it, and the second half crawling back. Diane smiled, but there was pain behind it. She died when I was 21. Stroke. She never saw me graduate. You took care of yourself after that? I survived, Diane said. I made money, built the company, proved I could climb the ladder faster than anyone. Marla didn't interrupt. But somewhere along the way, Diane added, I think I stopped climbing and just kept going. Like I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. Marla nodded slowly. And now you've stopped? Now I've stopped. A long silence. Good, Marla finally said. Because maybe now you can start again somewhere better. The real shift came the day they met Avery. She was 8. Small, wiry, and sharp-eyed. Diane first saw her sitting under a rusted canopy behind a closed laundromat in New Mexico, gnawing on a stale granola bar. A volunteer had tipped them off, said a few kids had been hanging around there, hiding from shelters. Marla crouched down beside her. You hungry? Avery nodded but didn't move. Diane took off her coat, a tailored wool one she'd stopped wearing in meetings, but couldn't quite give up, and laid it over the girl's shoulders. She didn't say anything, just sat there beside her until Avery finally whispered, Are you a mom? Diane froze. No, she said, but I could sit with you. For a while. Avery nodded. They stayed there for 20 minutes, not speaking, just sitting. It was the first time in decades Diane had simply been, without agenda, without urgency. That night, she called her team. I want to expand the program, she said. Not just diners. Not just meals. I want transportation. Emergency housing. A hotline. Safe zones. One of her VPs asked, Do we have the infrastructure for that? No, Diane replied. But we'll build it. We're not waiting for permission. 3 months into Project Marla, the impact was undeniable. Over 1,000 independent restaurants had joined the initiative. 400 children were being fed daily through the prepaid system. And perhaps most shockingly, a major national chain, Gold Stack Burgers, announced it would partner with Diane's team to implement a scaled version across all 900 locations. The press was everywhere. Headlines, podcasts, cable news. But none of that mattered more than the day Diane received a handwritten letter. It arrived without return address, scrawled in blue ink on wrinkled notebook paper. Dear Miss Diane, I'm the boy from the pancakes. I saw you looking at me. I didn't know who you were, but I know now. My name is Elijah. I'm okay. I got picked up later that day by a woman named Carol. She helps kids like me. She saw the story on the news and found me. She said I changed everything. But it wasn't me. It was you. And the nice lady at the diner. Thank you for seeing me. I won't forget. Elijah. Diane read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling more with each pass. Then she placed it in a small wooden frame and hung it above her desk, the same one her mother's photo once stood on. In her next speech, Diane didn't use a teleprompter. She stepped up to the podium, crowd of donors and dignitaries watching, and said, I used to think power meant being unreachable, that if people couldn't touch you, they couldn't hurt you. But I was wrong. The truth is, power means using your reach to lift someone else. Applause. She held up the letter. This, she said, is worth more than any award I've ever received. Meanwhile, Marla was being flooded with letters of her own. Some were from fellow servers, sharing their own quiet stories of compassion. Others came from kids, former runaways, foster youth, teens who'd aged out of the system and remembered someone like her who once handed them a sandwich without asking for anything in return. One letter simply read, You reminded me that not everyone gave up on me. Thank you for that. Marla never cried in public. But one day, Diane walked into the diner and found her sitting at the counter, tears on her cheeks, holding a small crocheted heart sent from a 10-year-old girl in Iowa. I didn't do anything special, Marla said. Diane put an arm around her. Yes, you did, she whispered. You saw someone. That's more special than anything. But not everyone approved. A board member at Mercer Holdings went public, calling Diane's efforts a distraction and accusing her of siphoning company resources. Investors grew nervous. Analysts warned of a mission drift. Diane was given a choice: scale back, or step down. She didn't hesitate. "I resign," she said. The next morning, the story broke. CEO steps down to lead national hunger relief movement. The markets dipped. Stockholders panicked. And within a week, Mercer Holdings received more new applicants and public goodwill than it had in a decade. People were starving not just for food, but for leaders with soul. At a celebration event that fall, Marla stood on a stage for the first time in her life. She wore a navy dress that didn't quite fit and shoes she borrowed from her neighbor. Diane stood beside her. A crowd of over 300 cheered. Marla looked out at them, nervous. Then she said, "I didn't do this for applause. I fed a kid 'cause I was a hungry kid once." That's it. Pause. Don't wait for someone like Diane to come to your diner. Look around. There's probably someone you can help right now. Don't need to be rich. Just need to care. The room erupted in applause. Diane turned to her, smiling with tears in her eyes. "You're the reason I remembered how," she said. Marla just patted her shoulder and muttered, "Don't get sappy on me now." 3 months had passed since Diane Mercer officially stepped away from Mercer Holdings. 3 months since she stopped being the woman people whispered about in boardrooms and started being the woman they talked about on playground benches, at soup kitchens, in community gardens, and in broken-down diners with hearts that beat louder than their cash registers. The day after she resigned, Diane had expected to feel regret. Instead, she felt free. No suits, no spreadsheets, no pressure to prove or perform. She spent her mornings visiting food drop-off sites, her afternoons helping volunteers restock kitchens, and her evenings answering messages from strangers' mothers, teachers, pastors, nurses, all asking how they could join the mission. And they weren't the only ones. The president's office had reached out. Not directly. Not yet, but a quiet inquiry came through a mutual contact, wondering if Diane would be open to advising a national task force on food insecurity. Diane said she'd think about it. But her heart was somewhere else. "Come see this," Marla said one morning, dragging Diane by the wrist through the back alley of their favorite cafe in Nashville. "What is it?" "Shoo," Marla whispered. They turned a corner. There, under a canvas awning, were 4 teenagers and a volunteer in a Project Marla vest. The kids were assembling bagged lunches, sandwiches, fruit, juice boxes. One of them had written "You Matter" on each brown bag in bright green marker. Diane watched in silence. Her chest ached. "These kids are all formerly homeless," Marla said. "They started this pop-up station themselves. Said they wanted to give back." Diane stepped closer. One boy, maybe 17, looked up and saw her watching. "You the lady on the flyers?" he asked. "I guess I am," Diane replied. He grinned, shy. "You changed stuff. Thanks." Diane knelt down to his eye level. "No," she said gently. "You changed stuff. I just finally paid attention." But not everything was running smoothly. As the program scaled, mistakes emerged. Some local restaurants were underreporting how many meals they served, keeping the extra cash. A regional coordinator had ordered bulk supplies and rerouted them to an unrelated nonprofit without permission. And worst of all, a shelter in Michigan reported that kids were lining up at food stations but not staying for long-term services, a troubling sign that food was helping, but deeper roots still needed tending. The backlash was quick. Media outlets pounced. One headline read, "Feeding the System. Is Project Marla too big to manage?" Diane didn't hide. She gave interviews, answered tough questions, released public audits, and owned the problems. "We're not perfect," she said in a live CNN segment. "But we are accountable. And we are learning. Fast." Still, it rattled her. She lay awake at night, fingers clasped behind her head, staring at the ceiling of the tiny one-bedroom she now rented outside of Atlanta. She missed her mother most on nights like that. Missed the quiet confidence of a woman who raised her on tips and exhausted grace. Marla noticed. "You've got that look," she said one morning. "What look?" "I'm carrying the world and pretending it's a purse look." Diane sighed. "I keep wondering, what if I can't hold this together? What if I built something too big? Marla chuckled. Good. Means it's not just yours anymore. Then came the invitation. A formal, gold-trimmed envelope delivered by hand. The White House. Diane was asked to attend a closed-door roundtable with key figures in education, health, and housing, all aimed at tackling child poverty on a national level. They wanted to model a federal program after Project Marla. She said yes. But first, she made one stop. The diner looked the same. Same cracked tile. Same hum of the cooler in the back. Same elderly man at the corner booth who never spoke, just read the newspaper cover to cover with a cup of decaf. Diane stood by the window, watching as Marla wiped down the counter. I need a favor, Diane said when Marla looked up. Name it. Come with me. To D.C. Marla blinked. Why? They need to see you, Diane said. They need to hear you say it. Not me. Marla hesitated. I'm just a waitress. No, Diane said. You're the woman who reminded me how to be human again. The round table was intense. Rows of policymakers, researchers, and legislators. Cameras in the back. Coffee in 2 small cups. Every question a minefield. Diane handled it with grace, clarity, and grit. But when Marla spoke in a voice raw with nerves, but steady with truth, the room changed. I don't know much about numbers, she said. I don't have charts or graphs. But I know what it's like to go to bed hungry. I know what it's like to see a kid walk in with eyes that say they don't trust anyone anymore. And I know that when someone feeds you without asking why, it changes you. Not just your stomach, your heart. Silence. Then applause. Long-standing. A senator leaned over to Diane and whispered, She's the real deal, isn't she? Diane smiled. She always was. In the weeks that followed, Project Marla was approved for federal pilot funding. Cities like Detroit, St. Louis, and Albuquerque launched test programs with measurable success. Food trucks with the Project Marla logo parked outside high schools. Breakfast stations opened in rural libraries. Even corporate cafeterias began offering pay-it-forward options. Diane received hundreds of letters a week. But one stopped her cold. It came from North Carolina. No name. Just, you probably don't remember me. But my sister worked nights at that hotel in the 90s. You used to wait for her at the end of the hallway. You once gave me half your sandwich because I said I didn't eat lunch that day. I never forgot that. Turns out you didn't either. Diane stared at the paper, her hands trembling. The hallway. The sandwich. She remembered now. Jeremy, her mother's co-worker's kid. He'd been scrawny, always too quiet. She hadn't thought about him in 30 years. She found herself crying full, unfiltered tears. Because in a world where so many things get lost, some kindnesses echo back, like boomerangs from time itself. That fall, a ceremony was held. Not a glamorous one. Not black tie. Just a gathering of people, hundreds of them in a park in Nashville, under lights strung from tree to tree. Formerly homeless youth stood beside restaurant owners. Volunteers hugged caseworkers. Toddlers danced near the food trucks while someone strummed a guitar. And at the center of it all, Marla and Diane, seated in mismatched folding chairs, paper plates in their laps, plastic forks in hand. Still think I should have stayed at the diner? Marla asked. Diane laughed. Still think I should have stayed a CEO? They clinked their sweet teacups together. Above them, a banner flapped gently in the breeze. Feed the heart. No questions asked. Later that night, after the celebration, Diane sat alone on a bench at the edge of the park. The soft glow of string lights blinked in the trees above her. Laughter echoed faintly in the distance, children playing tag in the grass, volunteers chatting, someone singing off-key near the grill. She looked down at her hands. Wrinkled slightly now. Her nails weren't manicured like they used to be. She wore sneakers, jeans, a fleece jacket, none of it expensive. And yet, she felt richer than she ever had. Marla approached quietly with 2 paper cups of cider. You disappear better than I expected. I'm thinking, Diane said. Marla sat down beside her. Dangerous habit. Diane glanced at her with a tired smile. Do you ever wonder if it's enough? All the time, Marla replied without hesitation. But I figured doing something is always better than doing nothing. Diane looked back at the kids. Sometimes I still feel like that little girl waiting with a grilled cheese sandwich in a hallway that smelled like bleach and loneliness. Marla nodded. That girl built this. Out of nothing but grit. Diane took the cider. I keep expecting someone to come along and tell me it was all a fluke. Marla sipped hers. Let them try. They sat in silence again. And then Marla said something that Diane would carry with her for the rest of her life. You know what kindness is? She said. It's hope disguised as a sandwich. Diane blinked. Her throat tightened. That's going on the website, she said, voice cracking. Marla patted her leg. Then spell my name right. The next morning brought a sharp turn in the wind. A call came through at 7:42 a.m. A fire. One of the newly opened community kitchens in Detroit had been vandalized and set ablaze overnight. No one hurt, thank God, but the building was destroyed. Graffiti on the alley wall read, "Stop feeding the lazy. Get a job." Diane stared at the screen, a familiar weight rising in her chest. Not fear fury. Marla was already on the phone. We'll rebuild. Don't care what it costs. It's not about the money, Diane muttered. No, Marla agreed. It's about the message. And we don't let fear write it. By noon, Diane was in Detroit. The kitchen was still smoking when she arrived. Police tape flapped in the wind. Volunteers stood stunned on the sidewalk. Some were crying. A child, maybe 10, clung to a woman's coat. Diane stepped into the ashes. The smell of plastic, burnt paper, and despair hung thick. She turned to the crowd. No one's backing down, she said. Reporters were already gathering. Do you have a statement? One asked. Yes, Diane replied. I do. She looked directly into the nearest camera. You can burn a building, but you can't burn out compassion. We'll feed from tents if we have to. We'll serve from parking lots. And if anyone thinks intimidation will slow us down, they should know this: we were never afraid of hard things. We're built for them. The clip would air that evening on every major network, and donations surged. Still, it took its toll. Over the next weeks, Diane threw herself into the rebuild. She slept 4 hours a night, skipped meals, took calls while pacing empty parking garages. Marla noticed the wear. You look like death microwaved, she said one day. I'll rest when it's fixed, Diane answered. But that night, her body gave out. She collapsed in her kitchen, just short of midnight. She woke up in a hospital room. The lights were low. A heart monitor beeped gently at her side. Her arm was hooked to fluids. She tried to sit up, winced. The door opened. Marla walked in with a grocery bag. Before you ask, she said, you fainted. Probably exhaustion. The doctor says you're lucky you didn't crack your skull on the counter. I'm fine, Diane croaked. No, you're not, Marla snapped. You've been trying to save the world on an empty tank. That's not noble, it's stupid. Diane didn't argue. Do you think if you stop for 2 days the whole thing will collapse? Marla continued. Diane looked at her, eyes tired. Yes, maybe. Well, it won't, Marla said. Because it's not just yours anymore. You built a village. Let them carry it for a minute. Tears stung Diane's eyes. I don't know how to let go. Marla sat beside her. You don't have to let go. Just let others help. They sat quietly. After a while, Diane whispered, You brought snacks? Marla grinned. Peanut butter crackers. Hospital vending machine was out of everything else. Diane smiled weakly. Good. Hate pudding. Recovery was slow, but deliberate. For the first time, Diane let her new team take the reins. She zoomed into meetings from her bed. Delegated. Trusted. Watched as the people she'd trained, many of them volunteers who once stood in food lines themselves, now ran full departments with competence and grace. It humbled her. And one night, alone in her apartment, she finally opened the last letter in her stack. She'd been putting it off. Something about the handwriting had stopped her. The return address was in Illinois. Inside was a single photograph. Her, age 6, standing outside the motel where her mother worked, holding a paper bag. On the back, in faded ink, "You were always meant for something bigger. Love, Mom." Diane pressed the photo to her chest and sobbed. Not with grief, with release. For the first time in 40 years, she felt like she had become exactly who her mother hoped she would be. 2 days later, she visited a new site in Baltimore, a community center rebuilt from a condemned warehouse. There were murals on the walls now, bright yellows, sky blues. Children's handprints formed a mosaic heart on the back entrance. One little girl ran up and hugged her waist. "Thank you for feeding us," she whispered. Diane knelt. "Do you know what you just did?" she asked the girl. The girl shook her head. "You fed me right back." The days grew shorter as fall gave way to early winter. The air had sharpened, and Diane found herself walking slower through the streets, noticing things she used to miss: a pair of mittens left on a bench, steam rising from a bakery vent, a toddler's giggle cutting through morning fog. The world, it seemed, had softened with her. But something lingered, a restlessness, like a door still slightly ajar. She sat on the edge of her bed one evening, flipping through an old photo album she hadn't touched in decades. Most of the pictures were faded birthdays without cake, holidays with only a string of lights, her mother in her maid uniform, standing proudly with a bent vacuum hose in one hand. And then she found it. A picture she didn't remember posing for. She must have been 7, standing beside a boy with a chipped tooth and scuffed shoes. He was grinning at the camera. She was handing him something wrapped in foil. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, "Jeremy, never forget him." Diane's chest tightened. Jeremy. She remembered now. The sandwich. The hallway. His quiet, "Thank you." That didn't sound like much then, but now echoed with meaning. She stood, grabbed her laptop, and searched for him. Jeremy Holden. Chicago. Age range 4045. It took hours, one dead end after another, until finally a blog appeared. How one kid survived the foster system and came back to help others. There was a photo. He looked older, of course, but the eyes were the same. Beneath it, a caption: Jeremy Holden, founder of Path Forward, a nonprofit helping teens age out of foster care. Her throat caught. He was still helping people, just like her. The next week, she flew to Chicago. She didn't tell anyone. No media. No team. She didn't even tell Marla. This one was personal. The office of Path Forward was small, a converted church with mismatched furniture and warm lights spilling through stained glass. Kids milled around the common room, playing cards, studying, listening to music. At the front desk, a young woman looked up. "Can I help you?" Diane hesitated, heart pounding. "I'm here to see Jeremy Holden. I think he might remember me." The woman studied her. "He's in back. Give me a sec." Moments later, Jeremy emerged, taller than she remembered, his hair peppered with gray. He walked with the calm of someone who had lived through chaos and come out whole. He didn't recognize her at first. But then she said, "Hallway. Sandwich. 1991. And he froze. "Diane." She nodded. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then, "I thought I dreamed that." They sat on a couch in the corner. The din of the room faded. "I found your photo," she said. "I didn't know back then how much it mattered." Jeremy laughed softly. "I didn't either. Not until years later. When I was bouncing between group homes and one night, I thought, someone once saw me, even just for a second, and it made me want to stay alive long enough to do the same for someone else." Diane's eyes welled. "We both ended up here," she whispered. Jeremy smiled. "Kindness doesn't vanish. It just travels." They spent the afternoon swapping stories. Jeremy had read about Project Marla, had even modeled some of his program's community kitchens after it. They joked about being the two kids who never stopped handing out food. Before she left, he hugged her. "I think your mother would be proud," he said. "She always believed in giving," Diane replied. "Even when we had nothing. She gave you. That was enough." On the flight home, Diane wrote in her journal, "We're all connected by invisible threads, moments that seem small until they grow into lifelines. Sometimes, The thing that saves us is something we gave away without even knowing. She slept for the first time in days. That winter, Project Marla hit a milestone: 1 million meals served. News outlets ran features. Schools held Marla Days, where students volunteered in their towns. A major publisher offered Diane a book deal she declined, instead suggesting the story be told by the youth they served. She knew whose voices mattered now, and hers was no longer the loudest. At the 1 millionth meal celebration, Marla stood beside her once again. Same blue coat, same modest stance. But this time, there was a crowd of hundreds: kids, families, volunteers, even former skeptics. Diane stepped to the microphone. "This isn't my story," she said. "This is a story about a waitress who gave a meal without asking why. About a boy with empty hands and a hungry heart. About thousands of quiet heroes who cook, serve, and sit beside people who just need to be seen." She turned to Marla. "I was successful for 30 years, but I wasn't whole until I sat in your booth." Marla's eyes shimmered, but she said nothing, just squeezed Diane's hand. In the months that followed, Project Marla expanded to 8 countries. Not in name, always, but in spirit. In Cambodia, a rice cart handed out free porridge bowls labeled "You Matter." In Poland, a bakery served compassion bread to street children. In Colombia, a retired teacher turned his home into a dignity kitchen. They wrote to Diane, sent pictures, stories, thanks. But it was Elijah's second letter that mattered most. It came in spring. Typed this time, more formal. "Miss Diane, I'm doing well. Carol helped me find a foster family. They're really nice. I started drawing again. I like drawing people when they're not looking. You were the first person I ever saw who looked at me like I wasn't a problem. I won't forget it. When I grow up, I want to be like you. Elijah." Diane framed that one too, right beside the first. Her health improved. Her team thrived. And every Sunday, without fail, she still met Marla at the original diner where the coffee was still terrible and the world had once quietly shifted. They didn't talk about success, or donations, or numbers. They talked about little things: what someone's laugh sounded like, the flavor of a new pie, whether the rain meant fewer kids would show up at the park. And sometimes they said nothing at all, because they'd already said everything that mattered. The final line of the final article ever written about her said this: "Diane Mercer learned what billionaires rarely do, that the richest thing you can give is yourself." That summer, Diane returned to her hometown for the first time in almost 40 years. It wasn't for a ribbon cutting or a press event. She came alone, with a rented car and nothing but a tote bag of old photos and a faded address scribbled on a torn envelope. The apartment building was still there: crumbling bricks, a broken buzzer, windows taped from the inside with cardboard. But the hallway? It smelled the same. Faint bleach and distant echoes of television through thin walls. She stood there for a long time, remembering. Her mother's tired steps coming up the stairs. The soft click of the door. The way she used to whisper, "I brought you something, baby," even if it was just crackers and a kiss. That hallway had held all her beginnings. Now, she wanted it to witness her peace. She tucked a photo of her mother behind the rusty mailbox marked "To Be," whispered, "I kept the promise," and walked out into the sunlight. A few weeks later, Marla surprised her. They were walking through a community garden in Austin, a Project Marla site, where formerly incarcerated women grew vegetables and learned to cook. "I did a thing," Marla said, fishing into her purse. "Oh no," Diane muttered, grinning. "Not another button campaign. I still have the one that says feed people, not paperwork." "Nope. Bigger than buttons." Marla handed her a folder. Inside were legal papers. Diane blinked. "Wait. This is the diner." Marla nodded. "I bought it." Diane's jaw dropped. "You what?" "Used the last of that donation the kids raised for me. And a little savings. The owners were ready to retire. I figured we couldn't lose where it all started." "You're incredible," Diane whispered. "I know," Marla replied. "But that's not the best part." Diane flipped the last page. Marla's Diner and Hope Hub, a new nonprofit built around the diner itself. Open daily, part cafe, part drop-in shelter, part training space for at-risk youth learning to work in kitchens and customer service. Diane laughed then cried. You just couldn't let me have the last word, could you? Never, Marla smirked. They opened it 6 weeks later. Not with fanfare with pancakes. Kids served. Local musicians played guitar on the sidewalk. Diane wore an apron and poured coffee for 2 hours straight. Marla taught someone how to flip hash browns without burning the edges. The line stretched around the block. Someone spray-painted a mural across the back wall. 2 hands passing a plate, one old, one young. Beneath it, in bold white paint. It started here. Years passed. Project Marla spread to 30 countries. Diane refused to let it become an empire. It stayed human. Small teams. Real stories. Simple systems. More listening than preaching. More sitting than standing. She turned down awards. She accepted hugs. She never forgot the boy, the meal, the moment. One morning, much later when Diane's hair had gone entirely silver and Marla's knees had betrayed her, the two sat side by side on a bench just outside the original diner. A little girl, no older than 6, ran up and handed them each a paper flower. For being nice, the girl said, and ran off. Diane looked down at it, a messy little thing, colored outside the lines. But it was perfect. She turned to Marla. You think we ever really changed the world? Marla considered it. No, she said. But we change people. And people are the world. Diane nodded slowly. Then smiled. Good. That's enough for me.